Good afternoon. My name is Sue Rout, and I'm not going to go into too much more detail. As a teaser, I will be rejoining you as part of a panel later in the day with other colleagues to talk about some of the support systems, some of the work that you have encouraged, that you have contributed to, and have taken even further. So many really friendly and successful, incredibly successful in an international market context faces in the room, and we want that to be duplicated, and this is the way we can do that, is by learning from each other. So I'm here representing Global Affairs Canada, but even more particularly the Trade Commissioner Service, which sits inside of that federal department. And you're going to be hearing from a lot of different federal representatives and colleagues, and happy to continue to make those connections for you, because that federal network, provincial network, municipal network, that's where, let them, let us, let me try and take some of that heavy lifting off of your plate to be able to help you succeed in international markets. So this first plenary of the summit is going to look at some of the current global economic and business environment and implications that are happening and being impinged on corporations and on diverse companies. Possibly we'll address some of the parts of the question that was asked about what in 2019 are we going to do about things. It's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Mr. Krishen Ranasagami, Senior Economic Advisor, Economist with the National Bank, and Mr. Gary Edwards of Gulfdale Consulting. Let me just say a few words as they join us on stage. The first panelist, Krishen, will be talking, has been Senior Economist with the bank since 2011. And as such, he is involved in the development of forecast scenarios for the Canadian and US economies, as well as in currencies. Krishen is going to set the stage and the overall context of the conference by giving us a general overview of the state of the global economy and the kind of environment businesses can expect and will be operating in the coming years. Please, if you would please join us on stage. Krishen's presentation will be followed by that of Gary Edwards of Gulfdale Consulting. As co-founder and CEO of Gulfdale Consulting, Gary will make a presentation of the key findings that came out of the first survey ever undertaken with the Canadian LGBTQ+ business community to identify and better understand the challenges faced by LGBTQ2+ businesses in their efforts at expanding their activities outside of Canada, something that we'll circle back to again in a later plenary as well. And finally, welcoming to the stage our moderator for this session, Jason Moody with Mars. Jason is a market research consultant working on Mars' market intelligence team, and one of the roles that he provides is market research and analysis to support Mars cleantech ventures all across the industry and across their phases of development. After our panelists' presentation, Jason will engage them and then be open to your questions. Jason, over to you. Excellent. Or then over me. Well, I'll let you. Oh, right over to Krishen first, I believe. Apologies. Krishen,
Hi.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Is this it? Q? Good. Right. Good afternoon. Thank you, Sue, for the warm introduction. And thank you all for inviting me here. It's an honor to be here. It's been a rough year and a half for investors trying to navigate through the uncertainties brought by geopolitical uncertainties, trade wars, and whatnot, and a mixture of those, basically wrecking markets. And which have basically got investors really concerned that, can the global economy actually withstand the unprecedented headwinds that have been served? And we get a lot of questions from clients basically asking us, are we heading towards a global recession a la 2008? And it's basically something that tend to be asked again and again, right? And so basically over the next 20 minutes, 15 minutes, right? I'm basically going to tell you the National Bank view of the global economy and highlight some of the risks that we think are worth looking at. And afterwards, there'll be a Q&A session, I believe, and feel free to ask. Okay? So I'm just going to start. This thing is not working. No. Okay. How do I move that? There you go. All right. So how? Actually, I went.
It's okay. I got it. Okay.
There you go. So, okay.
Yeah, he's hitting the
Can you go back one?
Oh, hold on.
Okay. There you go.
Krishen?
So yes.
Hit the green button.
Okay. So if you could summarize this chart into one sentence, is that investors don't like tariffs, right? Pretty straightforward. After Trump was elected, end of 2016, people were initially worried, very scared, and even. But then, stock market took off with his promises to cut taxes. He did promise he was going to raise tariffs, but people said, you know what, he's never going to do that. People were focusing on the tax cuts. Stock markets were ramping up significantly. This is basically the MSCI All Country Index, basically a summary of all the stock markets, an aggregate of all the stock markets in the world. And you can tell right after Trump was elected, rocket, right? So it went up as a rocket. And then came January 2018, right? And then you had the first wave of tariffs. That was, of course, the tariffs on solar panels and washing machines. Investors didn't really like that. Stock markets went down a bit, but temporarily people said, you know what, this is nothing. And then stock markets bounced back again, and then you had the second round, and then the US came up with steel and aluminum tariffs. Again, boom, down. And investors tend to forget, you know what, this is not going to last very long. And then came September of last year, right, first round of tariffs on China. 10% tariffs on half of imports, US imports from China. And then people start to get worried. And of course, it's the big dive after September. And then early this year, people said, you know what, politicians are not that stupid. Probably they're going to reverse course. And then, yeah, sure, people started talking about, you know what, the improvement of relationships, the improvement of negotiations. You see Trump even tweeting, you know what, negotiations are going well. And the Chinese are saying, you know what, yeah, sure, we're getting close to a deal. And then all of a sudden, a couple of weeks ago, no deal. And then the US basically increased tariffs to 25% on basically half of Chinese imports. So, and not only that, they also threatened to impose tariffs on the remaining half of imports from China, which so far haven't been affected by tariffs. And this is where we are today, right? So basically, investors don't like tariffs, and politicians are probably not the smartest people in the world, right, as you can tell. Why do you think investors don't like tariffs, right? Because people actually understand this relationship, right? So you hear about economists, people like me, telling you free trade, good thing, right? And we just don't say this because it's nice to say, right? It's because it's backed by data, right? So this is basically just showing you the relationship between trade and global GDP growth, right? Anybody can see a relationship there? Yes, it goes like this, right? It's positive relationship. When trade flows, the global economy does well. When the global economy does well, trade flows. Now, what happens when you interrupt global trade flows? Then you have a problem, right? So, and this is exactly what has happened. If you look at, since the US imposed tariffs in September on China, you've seen a sharp deceleration of trade flows. Actually, the left chart is showing you basically, you now have 2 quarters in a row where trade flows, global trade flows are down. So why is this significant? It's because we haven't seen this since the Great Recession of 2009, right? 2 straight quarters of decline. And of course, this affects export-centric economies, especially emerging markets, where basically they can't sell, but they continue to produce. In other words, inventories shoot up, right? Which is shown in the chart on the right. So inventories now in the emerging economies are at a 17-year high, right? So why is this a bad news? Why is this bad news? It's because, of course, that's going to impact production going forward and therefore hurt global growth. Now, if that was the end of it, You said, yeah, you know what, there'll be a slowdown in emerging markets, and that's it, right? They're going to bounce back eventually. But in other words, there'll be a small recession. But the problem is this could actually turn even uglier than a simple recession for the simple reason that it could actually deteriorate in a financial crisis in emerging markets. The left chart is basically telling you that debt in emerging markets at a record high, right, as a percentage of GDP and in absolute amount. And the right chart is basically telling you why, right? Because over the past decade, you've seen a significant ramp up in debt, right? And so much so that emerging markets now account for about a quarter of global debt in the non-financial sector. That's a lot, right? So why is this worrying? Because if you go back to the Asian financial crisis of '98, that share of debt was what, 5% roughly? Look at what it is now, almost a quarter of global debt. So if something bad happens to emerging markets now, the repercussions are probably going to be worse than what we saw back in 1998, right? In 1998, by the way, you had the Asian financial crisis, but the global economy as a whole still managed to grow, right? Because emerging markets were not that big. But now emerging markets are not only big, but they're also carrying a lot of debt, right? As a share of global debt, 25%, which is significant. So this slowdown in emerging markets has the potential of deteriorating into a full-blown financial crisis. And the bad news is that a lot of those emerging markets are borrowing in US dollars, and right now you see the US dollar is significant. The US dollar is rising, right? We know that, and it's almost near record high. And those holding US dollars are basically, not going to be very happy, right? Because repayments have to be done in US dollars, and that's another problem. It raises odds of default. Going to China, which is the biggest of the emerging economies. Of course, this chart is pretty straightforward. It basically tells you the story of what has happened since the US imposed tariffs, right? So exports to the US have slumped, right, as you can tell. So much so that China basically sells more goods to the European Union than it does to the United States now. That's not really good news because the European Union is not really a champion of growth at the moment. You really want to be selling to a high growth area like the United States. And this is not really happening for China. And of course, the tariffs are affecting factories, as you can tell. So the manufacturing sector fell into contraction territory at the beginning of the year, bounced back a little bit, but it still remains close to that contraction territory. If you look at that chart, though, not everything is bleak, right? So you look at the blue line, which is the composite, so that includes the services sector. So thanks to the services sector, China is still above water, right? So basically still generating some growth. And that's, if you're looking for a positive news story, that's it, right? And part of the reason why services are doing okay is because of the government's, Beijing's plan to actually shift growth recently, over the past few years, away from exports towards consumption. And that's helping support the domestic economy as opposed to the export sector. But still, so that's good news. And also, the other thing that basically gives us hope that not everything is bleak in China is that you have, it's a centrally planned economy, right? So everybody understands that. And the government basically made clear that it's going to do whatever it takes to support growth. So they have an objective of 6% GDP growth this year and next. And they have the tools to actually deliver on that. They have, of course, we've seen fiscal policy, tax cuts in China, beginning of this year. You have monetary policy that remains very, very stimulative. You have the central bank that lowered interest rates significantly, and that's basically helping boost the domestic economy, even as the export sector falls into the red, right? And this is basically just an idea, if some people say, government pockets are not large enough in China, then I show them this chart. This is basically government debt. So in other words, they have a lot of room to actually borrow and engage into spending, right? Not just current government spending, but also infrastructure spending to actually boost the domestic economy. So that's China. Looking at the Eurozone quickly, so I alluded earlier that this is not the fastest economic zone in the world. Yeah, sure, you're seeing a deceleration in growth in the Eurozone. The concerning part is that recently you saw that red line. Actually, forget about the top chart, the top half of the graph. Just look at the bottom chart, the bottom half, excuse me. So the red line is industrial production, right? So it's now in the red, basically under zero. So basically industrial production is actually contracting year on year. The last 2 times this happened, you had a recession in the Eurozone. Now, is the Eurozone, is that going to be third time unlucky for the Eurozone, right? That's a big question. If you look at that chart, you sort of get some encouragement though, right? So, because unlike the last 2 instances, this time, now look at the top chart of the graph, you actually see credit in the Eurozone actually expanding at a healthy pace, right? So whether it's for consumers, which is households, or the non-financial sector. So credit is flowing, unlike the last 2 instances. So that's good news for consumption, that's good news for investment spending. And of course, we know why credit is expanding. It's the European Central Bank that actually has basically opened the money taps. Monetary policy is extremely loose there. And that's basically helping, in our view, the Eurozone. That's why we're not really anticipating a recession. I mean, we could be wrong, but for the reasons I'm going to mention. But based on that, things are not as bad as they were, let's say, in 2012 or 2006, 2008, right? That said, there are lots of landmines that hopefully policymakers will be able to avoid, right? And we know that, for example, one landmine is the political situation, right? So you had the Yellow Vest movement in France. That could deteriorate into something really ugly. But more importantly, you have the possibility that the US basically delivers on its threat to impose tariffs on the Eurozone. And here I'm talking about cars, right? So cars, the Americans want to, they're threatening at least. And if you look at the past actions, you wouldn't want to underestimate what they're saying. They think about imposing tariffs on German cars. And that would be a complete disaster, right? Because we know how Germany basically relies on on exports. And if autos are taxed, in other words, tariffs on autos, that would be something very, very bad for the Eurozone. Hopefully, like I said, when we do our base case scenario, we're assuming politicians are not stupid. Maybe that's a stretch, right, given what we've seen recently. But we do the best we can. We're assuming people use common sense. So that's one big risk, which is the US tariffs on autos. The second big risk, of course, I mentioned the political movement, social yellow vest and so on, but also Brexit, right? So, this chart is basically just telling you what happens, what is happening in the UK right now. And they haven't even left, right? They're not yet, they're still in the European Union, and you're already seeing the impact on investment spending in the UK. Of course, that's a terrible thing happening in the UK right now, but the Eurozone itself is going to be exposed because a bunch of its exports go there, right? So, according to an estimate from Eurostat, Germany's GDP, actually 2% of Germany's GDP depend on exports to the UK, right? So the Eurozone is, of course, going to be hit if, at the end of October, the UK leaves without a deal with the European Union, right? So you really don't want a no-deal scenario whereby you go back to the WTO tariffs of 3%. That's going to hurt both sides significantly. So that's, so far what I've talked about are basically cyclical trends, right? That, maybe if we speak again next year or 2 years from now, those won't be an issue anymore. But one issue that's probably going to be more persistent is this, right? The rise of populism. So why am I putting this here? Because it sort of relates a bit to the earlier chart I showed you about trade. So this is going to be an issue because there are forces that are actually trying to basically dial back from globalization, basically deglobalization forces. People are really unhappy, and they're saying, you know what, we didn't benefit from the gains that you economists are promising us that we're going to get from globalization. So we want out of the global market. And there you have people really unhappy for the simple reason that they have a point if you look at this chart, because in a lot of countries you have, so basically you want to be, in this chart you want to be in the lower left corner. You really don't want to be on the top right corner where you have the social immobility and the highest income inequality, right? So if you look at that chart, right, who is on the top right corner? You see the United States, right? Italy, the UK, France, Switzerland, and Spain, right? And it's not really a coincidence, right? USA, what did you get there? You got Trump, right? Italy, you got Salvini, right, coming to power, anti-immigrant, and very populist, on populist policies. France, yellow vests, right? So this is basically not really a surprise that populism is rising in those economies where you have people who feel left out, right? And the reason I tell you this is why this is going to be an issue, not just today, not just next year, but for the many years, is because politicians still don't get it. They still don't get it. Like when economists tell them, you know what, global trade, globalization is good, as long as you can compensate for the losers. Politicians say, yeah. They take the first half of what we tell them, right? Forget the second half, right? And this is what you have as a result, right? So globalization is good as long as you can compensate the losers, right? This is what economists tell politicians. Unfortunately, they don't listen to the whole story. And they still don't do it, and I think that's why we're going to still have an issue. So basically, a lot of people are telling me, like, they don't think Trump is going to win. I'm not so sure about this, right? Next year, I still think he has a shot, right? Because there are a lot of people who are not very happy with how things are going right now. So that's basically something that's structural, right? And a big risk to the global economy if you go through a deglobalization phase. And of course, the global economy is going to suffer. So a quick word on the US. So the world's largest economy, it's booming right there in the US. The longest business cycle ever, right? And of course, people, when you see the expansion going that long, people are starting to ask questions. How long is that going to last? Are we getting close to a recession? And those concerns become even louder when you get something like this, right? The inversion of a yield curve. What that is, it's simply showing that the 10-year yields have actually fallen below 3-year yields. 3-month yields, right? So the long yield has fallen below the short yields. Why is this important? It's because when this happens, often in the past, when this happened, you had a recession soon after, right? So that explains why people are concerned about this. But there are instances where this happened and you did not have a recession, right? 1966 and 1998. So in our view, when clients ask us, you never say we're sure about this, but we're saying, you know what? Of course, it's a possibility that the US basically goes into recession, but in our view, we don't think so. For the simple reason that, if you look at consumers in the US, actually that's a trick in forecasting for the US economy, by the way. If you can forecast what's going to happen to consumers, you actually have a really good take on what's going to happen to the US economy as a whole. Why? Because consumers, it's 70% of US GDP. So, and our view of the consumer in the US, it's pretty good. So that was not sustainable, right? So you see house prices rising way faster than income before the crash. Look right now, right? So right now, house prices are rising, yes, but not out of sync with income, right? So in our view, there's still room to grow for the housing market to grow in the US, and that's good for consumption spending, right? Of course, because consumers feel richer, it's called the wealth effect, and they spend more. So, but not everything is rosy in the US, of course. I'm not saying you're going to see expansion forever. Yeah. Tariffs basically are something that you should watch for, of course. And why is that? US tariffs could actually come back and bite the US. Just to give you an idea, more than 20% of corporate profits in the US come from abroad, right? So eventually it's going to come back and bite them. And if you're a stock market investor and you're focusing more on the S&P 500, 40% of S&P 500 companies have profits that come from abroad. So you bet it's going to have an impact on corporate profits, and it could come and hurt investment spending. Of course, tariffs raise inflation. That's not good for consumers. But this, I decided to put this here because I think that's a very, very pressing issue. It's corporate debt. You probably read about this in the media, but that's one thing that could actually derail not just the U.S. economy, but the whole entire global economy. Remember subprime back in 2008, when basically consumers were leveraging like there's no tomorrow. Everybody who had a pulse was getting a mortgage in the U.S., right? So right now, corporations are behaving like this, right? In the U.S., corporate debt at a record high. And the right chart is basically telling you that the quality of debt is actually declining. In other words, anybody could actually, even low-rated corporations are able to issue debt. And that's not good news for financial stability, right? You just need a slight increase in interest rates or, a deceleration in US economic growth, and those things could actually deteriorate into something really bad. And of course, there's a budget deficit. That's always an issue. I know Trump has, the economy of the US is growing really well, world leader in terms of growth, but this has come at the expense of a budget deficit. So I remember those tax cuts. Well, it's not free, right? Tax cuts are not free. You're actually making the budget deficit worse. So eventually, somebody's going to have to deal with this, and when they do, they're going to raise taxes or cut spending, and that's not going to be good for the US economy. But for now, I don't think Trump is going to do this because he wants growth. It's going to be an issue for another president, maybe 4 or 5 years, 8 years, I don't know. But that's something that could basically hurt. But overall, the US economy, we're pretty optimistic about this year, if assuming the corporate debt situation doesn't deteriorate. So I know there's not much time. I was going to talk about Canada. I know you guys, the speech was about the global economy today, but Canada also has good things happening, right? So you see, we've sort of kept up with the US in terms of growth. We've done better than them in terms of employment creation. Oil price is bouncing back. Housing market is stabilizing after the federal government tightened mortgage rules. So you see the housing market had a big dip, but now it's stabilizing. There's no, mortgage delinquencies remain very, very low. So that's good news. And also, why is mortgage delinquencies staying low despite tighter mortgage rules? Is because we're creating jobs like crazy in Canada, right? So the labor market is booming. And the type of jobs that we're getting is private sector and full-time jobs, which is very good. Something else that's supporting the housing market is population growth. We're the world champion in terms of population growth, right? Well, not really world champion, but champion in advanced economies. It's not because we're good at making babies, it's because we're actually good at, getting immigrants, right? So then you can tell if it wasn't for immigration, we wouldn't be that, our population growth wouldn't be that impressive. So that's helping boost the housing market and the economy as a whole. And what's cool about this is that the type of immigrants we get are the most educated, right? So not bad, right? So that's good because why is this important? It's easier for them to actually integrate into the labor market, right? And support the economy and the housing market. The type of immigrants that we're getting also helping on a very important aspect, which is tech talent, right? Which is basically the let's say building blocks of the future industries, and we fare very well in that respect. So I'll skip that. Just to give you a summary, basically, of the issues ahead. So basically, the global economy, people are concerned about what they've been saying with Trump, with tariffs and so on, trade war between US and China. And those concerns are real, and it could certainly degenerate. I'm not going to lie to you. But politicians, I'm pretty sure even people in the White House, they're looking at what they closely watch the stock market, by the way, right? Very closely. So if they've been watching the closed market, as I think they have been, they'll probably get people in the White House asking questions there, questioning the U.S. strategy there into trying to escalate the trade war with China, right? So we think eventually they're going to do the right thing and basically step back from those disastrous tariffs And that's why we still think the global economy is going to grow this year, but you never know with politicians, right? Our assumptions is that, again, politicians do the right thing. In Canada, we're still positive about growth, 1.6% growth in Canada, despite the oil shock. What's important, I know a lot of you here are small businesses, you're looking at markets abroad. That's one of the charts I didn't show you, but exports in Canada are not doing very good, right? And that's one thing that I think government, I saw the minister earlier giving a speech, but I think government could do better in assisting our exporters to exploit all these markets overseas. In terms of currencies, we'll have a chance to talk more about that later, but I think currencies and rates, people understand that in an environment of low inflation, don't expect interest rates to rise a whole lot, right? So low interest rates are here to stay. And that's it. Thank you.
That was fabulous. Thank you very much, Krishen. I think giving an overview of impacts on the global economy in under 20 minutes is an unbelievable feat. So I think we owe him a second round of applause. And hopefully you'll be circulating this PowerPoint afterwards. And I would like to invite Gary Edwards up to the podium.
Thank you so much, Jason.
My pleasure.
Wow, that was a lot. I have to say, until about 20 slides ago and 8 minutes ago, I thought the term wreak havoc was like a great thing. So I've learned a lot today. We're going to see how you're wreaking havoc in the market. It's actually, in my context, a really great thing, which is what are the things you're doing to disrupt? What are the things you're doing to propel the LGBTQ plus community forward? And what we've got here is a snapshot of research that we did. Now, coincidentally, I didn't even know this going into it, but Bill Pellet and I worked together some years ago. He was my client. So the one thing he'd always ask me is, Gary, I really need fresh data. I need to look at, the most recent numbers. And so I'm so pleased to just have this little deja vu moment and be able to say, I've got some really fresh data for you here, Bill. We did a survey to try and understand just a couple of basic things. One is just, obviously on the issue of LGBTQ plus businesses, who's exporting, who's not, why or why not? We also wanted to find out a little bit around, well, what's the interest in it, and particularly the resources you might need if you choose to go that route, including doing some trade missions. So that's our objective today. We're going to look through some of the results from the discussions, from the surveys rather, and the discussions that were had from a series of roundtables that were done by the CGLCC across Canada, just looking into this very issue. So, when the green button works, we will move ahead. There we are. It's an online survey. We talked to just over 100 people who run businesses. Again, just to emphasize the point, these are LGBTQ plus run businesses, so leaders within the business community. Invitation was sent. No incentives other than, hey, we'd love your feedback. We need to get an understanding of what's going on within the community. Again, with a very challenged button. I could do this all from memory, but it's easier if there's a slide up there. Let's take a look at LGBTQ plus businesses here in Canada. It's a very unresponsive, if we could get some help. There we go. So the first result is you're not alone. In fact, quite the opposite. Minister Ng earlier was saying, and I don't know why, but I always find this kind of a good refresher, a bit startling. You pick up a business magazine, HBR, or you read Sloan, or you read The Economist, and it starts to invert. You start to think that every issue out in business is like a big business issue. You realize you have to realize what you're reading about is how big businesses are tackling the world. The reality is, these are Canadian numbers. The minister mentioned it earlier. 98% are in that micro to small business market. So when we did our survey, we want to make sure that survey is representative of the LGBTQ plus community, and also just take a look at, does that look any different from the rest of the population, the rest of the businesses? Now, as you can see here, if you add up the micro businesses, which are the ones under 5 people, and then go to everyone who's got a business up to 99 people, the distribution is pretty much just the same. So that's really good news for us as a surveyor to say that, look, we've got a good representative sample here. Now, there's been a lot of talk already today. I've been paying attention around, hey, we're just starting on the journey. The reality is for businesses, and so I want to call this first insight out for you, is many of you have been doing this for quite some time. It may be new to others, but it's not new to you. Like less than less than, as you can see here, it's like 1 in 10 or so are just starting their businesses, but many of you have been at it for some time. And so I think that's important context. The other thing that I think is really important in terms of context is, I wouldn't be the first one to point out, sometimes there are stereotypes. There are no stereotypes here in terms of what kind of businesses LGBTQ plus people run. They are completely diverse. And one of the things I love about the fact that there's so many small and micro businesses out there, you do these surveys and then you go talk to people, and I'll just, this is kind of a little hack for tonight when you're at a reception or just whoever you're speaking to. I always find it fascinating. If you talk to somebody who works for a big company in that 0.2% category of businesses that exist in Canada, say, well, what do you do? They always do this. The narrative is always this. They tell you the brand they work for. And then if you give them a blank stare, they tell you the sector. The thing I love about, which is fine, but the thing I love about working with businesses that are smaller in nature is it's just a much more intimate conversation. You ask somebody from a small business or a micro business what they do, they immediately start talking about the things they create for people, for the customers that they serve. There's an intimacy there around their connection to the customer, and I just think that's a wonderful thing to always keep at the forefront of your mind as you're talking to others about your business and as you're networking within the LGBTQ plus community. Is apparently 98% of the time, you're talking to somebody who's going to give you an intimate portrayal of how they're helping others in their business and the things they curate or create for others inside that business. I just think that's a wonderful thing to call out and always keep in the forefront of your mind when we're talking about business issues. Let's start with the story of success. Should you be happy? We did a survey. Survey says, in my view, as a business leader myself and being executive for many years, I look at this, I'm a very optimistic guy, even if it wasn't this positive, but it really is. The majority of people are saying they've got a business that's growing, and I think that's fantastic, almost 2/3. You break that out, most are growing in a way that you'd hope, which is they're growing by revenue. Don't have to give you the Business 101 lecture that says, look, you want to be able to grow that, the amount of customers you serve faster than the number of employees you have to hire. That's usually your biggest expense, particularly in a smaller business, but even in larger ones, the labor. So you're growing, and many of you are actually growing quite rapidly. So I gained some good news overall from the research that we conducted. Now, this might be a bit of an eye chart, but it's really simple in this sense. We just ask people, how do you expect to grow? So there's many different trajectories, but I like to think of 2 different vectors, right? You could just say, look, this is what I do, and I'm going to keep doing it and doing it for more people, delivering the product or service I've got to more people in the geography I've got. About 2/3 of people are doing that. Now, it's not an either or. You can be doing other things too. You can be saying, look, what I want to do next year is I want to kind of grow and do some other things. I want to offer some other services. I'm going to curate or create some other products and distribute them. And you can see, in terms of new products and services within the current market, we've got just under half who are going that route. Now, you could also go the other direction. You could get another vector for your business, say, look, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, but I want to make a brave new step and move into some new geographies. And you can see here just over half, 57% are doing this. And I just want to call your attention to it as you're in conversation and thinking of networking with others. Having worked with businesses for decades, it's an incredibly brave thing to do, to say, well, I'm actually going to do 2 things. I'm going to create some new stuff that customers value, and I'm going to take it to some new markets. And almost half of you have that ambition. I just think it's very laudable. And I understand how scary it can be, so I'm also here to say, you're not alone once again, and many of you are taking some very brave steps in terms of how you grow your business. We want to know then, and I'm so relieved after hearing the minister, that our percentages are really close to their percentages, and that's always just a good validation point. How many of you are exporting out of Canada currently? Got a good show of hands? If you were a representative sample, it would be half of you who are doing that, according to the survey. And the principal market, no different than the rest of businesses in Canada, is the US, but many are looking to Europe, Mexico, and elsewhere to do that as well. The average percent of your revenue, for those who are exporting, obviously, almost half are going to those exports. Now, many of you who are currently exporting, or others who are considering it, over half are looking at new markets. So in addition to the places you're already going outside of Canada, many of you are looking even further beyond those borders. And for most who are considering it, like 8 out of 10 want to do it this next year. So there's a lot of urgency to those who want to grow to get going and get going fast on it. Would be responsible to not talk through some of the challenges. We certainly asked and tried to get a good picture, and I think this is important, just so that, when you see something that makes you nervous or you see something that's kind of scary, it makes it a lot less scary to know, even if somebody's in a completely different business, that somebody else is tackling this same fear as you have, and that others have gone before you. So like any venture, it's good to have an understanding of, those who aren't exporting, why not? So we just flipped it over, that 49% who aren't exporting. There's lots of reasons. A lot of them are just businessy issues, right? The regulations, or, the dollar or what have you. I just want to make this a little simpler. I just took that list and kind of truncated it, just using common sense. For a lot of, number one reason for a lot is just, it's money. It's kind of complicated. This is a real big one for many people, which is just, look, I have no idea where to start here. And so we asked another survey question to really get at, and I think this is really helpful to the folks who are here to support you in government, especially with programs and also the CGLCC and others, is, if you can break it down to just two things. Is it really the money, or is it just like, it just, you looked into it, you can't afford it, or is it just really damn complicated, or at least it looks like it is? And you can see here, 2/3 are leaning towards, look, it just, for me, it looks super complicated. So you kind of Shark Tank yourself. You're like, and for those reasons, I'm out. So today is about, well, don't Mark Cuban yourself out just yet. You should stay in and consider it, especially when you look at what others are afraid of. We asked a whole range, some obvious ones, which are just, are there certain LGBTQ plus reasons for, I subscribe to LGBTQ Nations News, so I get that in my inbox. So like once a day, I just get a little slap. I'm like, oh my God, really? And so, there's frightening things, and I don't have to explain this to you, that happen in the world every day. That's a US base, so, and that's the primary export market under consideration. So I get the fear thing. I thought it would have been higher. When we look at the reasons why people aren't exporting, that exists for sure, that fear, but it's actually lower down the list of the obvious thing in business, which is just afraid of losing money. All of us have the fear of failure. If you're an entrepreneur, you're an incredibly courageous person. Courage is always, defined as the fact that you're doing something really super terrifying, but you're doing it anyways. It's not that you just don't feel the fear, it's you're working through it. As an entrepreneur myself and working with so many, that it really is the cold hard reality of everyday life as an entrepreneur. And obviously as an LGBTQ plus entrepreneur, you've got additional fears or anxieties that may go with that. But the number one reason, if we just talk about fear, is just the fear of unknown. So again, here, we're here to acknowledge that we can't make all the fear go away, but we've got some ideas of how you might be able to overcome that. So let's talk about exporting. Despite those fears, especially the fear of the unknown, more than 2/3 of you, 72%, are actually considering it. Obviously, a subset of that are people who are actually putting forward that strategic plan to do it. But, in between those two beautiful pie charts is the reality of that hesitation, that like, I'm not even sure where to begin. And so, in considering this, we asked, well, where would you go to for help? I think the obvious thing is, well, you just turn internally. You've got resources yourself, and I was actually pleased to see that this is the number one, because it's an obvious but clear signal of competence, right? You run a business, you figured that out, it's complicated, no matter what your business is, it's complicated, and you figured that out, so you can probably figure this out too. Challenge in conversation with most people is just, that other thing, which is called the business I run, kind of keeps me up day and night. So to learn a whole new thing, aside from what my customers want, and aside from what I have to create for them, and figure out a whole new market, like how does that work there? It's not you can't figure out, but kind of your hours in the day seem like they're already being well spent. So you do have other resources, the LGBT plus resources, and certainly the CGLCC, an obvious resource. But way down the list, and I think this is, it was very positive this morning, and I'm a super positive person. So the only thing I'd say is, government, politicians obviously do their best, but and there's obviously a real effort. But I don't know anybody in the business world who's said, hey, I'm really stuck. If I could just let's go on a government website and figure this out. What we discovered is that despite their efforts, the Trade Commissioner and to a lesser extent the industry associations haven't been. Somewhere there's a gap between what they're trying to tell you they can help with and what they are helping you with. And then if I could have a very humble moment, I'll tell you that I'm in the category of the gray over here, which is I didn't know anything at all. Like, I just assumed naively that Export Development Canada, like I had to be running like AT&T or something, and if I wanted a meeting. I had no idea. It was actually organized and set up. This is my little plug for them. It was actually organized and set up for micro and small businesses. So shame on me, I didn't know, but I don't think I'm that different than most in not even realizing that it's actually organized for micro and small businesses. Who's ever running the big business, they have resources of their own. They can have separate meetings. They don't need this service. It's really designed for you. So I didn't know that, but the good news is I'm not alone, because most of you didn't know it either. So shame on all of us or them or somebody, but the good news is it's available and ready for use. 23%, 16% for EDC. I just think those are just kind of remarkable results, and if you are an optimistic person, you just have to flip that around and say, wow, so I didn't know that, and now I've got a resource to go to. So I had a lot of fun, by the way, coming up with the graphics for this presentation. It might be time to go for some of you. Trade mission, our final part here. I think when I think of a trade mission, I think of, okay, so I've got myself organized, I got a plan, I know exactly who I want to meet with, I got it all figured out, and this is a way to get it done. I'm sure that's the case. But again, I'm going to share with you my experience. That's kind of a naive view. A trade mission can be more than that. I think because you're there with a cohort of people who are serious about going abroad, you want to have some serious intent in terms of considering it. But beyond that, I don't think you have to be fully committed. Somebody may get up on the stage and correct me. You don't have to be fully committed to doing it. You have to be fully committed to learning what you want to learn to go on a trade mission. So I'm just super positive about the results I see here. Many people are considering it. I've been on a couple of trade missions, and it was incredibly revealing. Sometimes you come back and just think, yep, I thought it was scary. It is scary. Now I know. Check that box. And I don't think, I've gone to one, not to the US, but to overseas. I just realized, okay, I had a great time. I've got a new and bigger network of people that I can do business with. So all the contacts I kept, I decided not to do it. So I'm not pushing here that, wow, this is going to be an epiphany and it's going to be a go for you. But it is an opportunity to sit down with people who probably aren't doing the same business you are. In fact, when they are, it feels sort of like you're with your competition. It's kind of weird. You're usually on these, just telling you again my experience, you're on a trade mission with others who are struggling with the same business issues, but are running different businesses. My experience is that's incredibly positive. And so I'd leave you with that. We're going to move to Q&A, but I think just the highlights from what we saw today are that there are some challenges for the LGBTQ plus businesses. But those challenges are ones we should keep in perspective. Most are doing well. Most have been doing it for some time. Most are growing. So first of all, it's really positive when you talk about the businesses you're in. You're among a cohort of really successful people. Second, when you consider exporting, it does look scary, but it mostly looks scary because we don't know what we don't know, and it takes time to figure out the don't knows of the don't knows. And so the third and final point is, look, you don't have to be the first to figure all this stuff out. There's resources for you within the government, within the CGLCC, and mostly within your own community to explore these opportunities here in Canada for going abroad. And with that, I would just like to say, again, on a personal note, this is a Canadian summit, but I live here in Toronto, and we're kind of, I know there's problems, but we're kind of blessed for the bubble we live in. I'll just leave you with the final thought, which is my discovery through this research, which is you have an opportunity to stay in that bubble, invite a few more people into your bubble, and take your bubble on the road. And I leave you with that thought for today. Get in the bubble, invite more into your bubble, take your bubble on the road, and figure out what other opportunities there are for you abroad, outside of your business here in Canada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary. This is working? Yes, it is. Okay, good stuff. Excellent. So I'm sure all of you have questions. I have some questions as well. Oh, the clicker. Thank you. Let's just keep that here. And I'd like to start with Krishen.
Okay.
So Krishen, you gave us an overview of volatility in the global markets for example, with Brexit, with the swelling of debt in emerging markets. So the economy is more volatile as a result and more predictable than it was just 12 months ago. So markets seem to be quite nervous, and people have spoken about even perhaps a collapse of the stock market in 2019. Are there reasons to be concerned?
Yes, well, that was the whole idea of the presentation today. I highlighted some of those risks, but because the blitz in the presentation, I sort of ended it with just the risks, but not the hopeful message that I'd like to convey now. And that hopeful message is that governments are, they understand the gravity of the situation, and they're ready to do whatever it takes, right? Especially in places like China, I mentioned. For the simple reason that we've been burnt recently by the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, right? So there are all those risks. Some of them will actually come true, right? And make things worse. But the thing is that governments know the cost of not doing anything or doing too little, because this is exactly what happened in 2008, 2009. We were late and we did too little, right? And that's why you had the worst recession since the Great Depression. I think governments, like I said, they're ready. So we have a fiscal policy. China has a lot of room to actually do more in terms of spending, government spending, and central banks are ready. So we've experimented with new tools like quantitative easing, for example, that didn't exist before the financial crisis, and negative interest rates even, which are still in effect, by the way, in the Eurozone. So we've developed some tools from this financial crisis that could be used again.
Okay. And are there any specific markets that you would flag as being a risk, or on the opposite side of that, particularly appealing based on their prospects going forward?
Well, actually, the answer to both of those questions is emerging markets, right? So I pointed out the risks, but emerging markets, they'll eventually come back, right? And this is where the middle class is. The emerging middle class. Exactly, the emerging middle class is. So you really want to be in that market. Coming back to some of the charts that Gary showed, I mean, those were excellent charts. And one of the charts, I'm glad actually I didn't elaborate on this, because that I would have intersected too much with what you're saying, but you're absolutely right. Exports. So I highlighted all the positive things about Canada, right? But exports is not one of the positive things for Canada. And I'll just give you an idea. Non-energy goods exports in Canada hasn't changed at all since 2007. Right? Flat. And the Canadian dollar has actually depreciated more than 10%, 15%, more than 15% over that period. So the problem is not the currency, right? People, yesterday I was on BNN, the guy was asking me, shouldn't we just depreciate the currency, and that would be the solution for exporters? And I just gave him that example, right? Non-energy goods exports haven't done a thing, right? Even though the Canadian dollar has depreciated. So there are more things, like structural problems for exporters. And I think Export Development Canada, which you mentioned, they could do more, they should do more, right? So that's one of the questions you should have asked the minister here. She mentioned 1.5 billion potential customers from our trade deals. Guess how many of those we're actually accessing, right? How many? So just to give you an idea, right? We have 45,000 exporters in Canada. More than 70% of those exporters export to just one country, the United States, right? United States, 325 million people. 1.5 billion, we're looking at 20% of that market. So a lot of untapped potential that And for the reason you mentioned, right? It's hard for small businesses to access those markets. They need help, right? Export Development Canada has a role to play there.
Getting back to the currency depreciation, would you say that the depreciation in Canadian currency is an actual value proposition for ventures that want to export?
Well, I don't think that's a solution, right? One of the charts I didn't show is because, yeah, it's a double-edged sword, right, if you will. Yeah, sure, you could gain some competitiveness by depreciating the Canadian dollar, but then what happens to your imports of machinery and equipment? Those become more expensive. Are you going to invest? And one of the charts that I didn't show because of it was exactly that. What we saw over the past few years is a depreciation of the Canadian dollar, and you see price of machinery and equipment just shot up. And the result is that, of course, business investment in machinery and equipment sank, right? And we don't want that to happen. We actually need investment in machinery and equipment to boost productivity. So by resorting to currency depreciation we believe, make life easier for our exporters, we actually penalizing them because they're not able to invest in machinery and equipment.
Great. Thank you. Amazing. Gary.
Yes.
I have questions for you.
Uh-oh.
So that presentation was amazing. Thank you very much. It seems like you've turned out a lot of insight on where LGBTQ businesses position themselves, but also the resources that are out there. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are on what's holding those businesses back from exporting.
I just want to answer that question by reinforcing, there's always like one or two things you take away from a presentation. It's really just fear of the unknown. On top of, we're already super busy, right? So that's a hard thing to overcome. People who run businesses completely get this. People who don't think, if you're an employee, I understand you might work hard, but if you're running your own business, it's that much harder because you're all in, right? Your complete life and anybody, right? Or any animals that you support, like your whole network of whether it's yourself or a family or others depends on you succeeding. And to carve out some time to figure something else out beyond what you're trying to do to keep your customers happy, that's a super difficult thing to do. Like it's the absolute opposite of a trivial exercise. It's a serious one. So I think the unknown is what's frightening. But just keep reminding yourself, first of all, most people have been doing this for a while. Canada's an export. I keep hearing politicians talk about, Ontario's open for business or Canada or what have you. I'm like, most of us are selling into the US. Like, you look at the numbers. What we really need to know is, are they open for business? Like, will I get closed out? Politicians need to say, US is open for business, I've got your back, we can help you do this. Is the reality I'm not giving you a political sloganeering, I'm telling you the reality of trying to do business in Canada, typically into the US. You need to know they're open for business. You got it figured out here. So, I think I'm just honest, like I'm really naive about the resources out there, but their obligation is to make it easier for you. And I just want to point this out, because I might be wrong, but it's a worthwhile discussion. This notion that there's kind of a lottery or we're going to pick some winners and losers and, there's not enough money to go around, that's a government thing, and I understand it, I'm not here to critique it. But beyond picking some winners, just making sure that, look, for everybody who wants to do this, you need a basic access to some resources that helps you get it done. So I understand the economic view, which is you need capital to expand, but a lot of what you need from the research that we looked at is just somebody who helps you kind of break it down, like this is step one, this is step two, here are the forms, fill it out. It's not that hard, and there's going to be somebody by your side to help you succeed in doing that, because the US, not the only one, but these are huge markets. So for at least a few of the top ones, I think there's an obligation for those who offer these government services to make it easy for you to walk through it, whether or not you've been picked as a winner or loser. Everyone deserves that help, and it's essential for the Canadian economy, not just for the LGBTQ plus community, to make sure that's easy to do.
That's great, thank you. And to continue on that, I think that we might actually have some ears in the room to get this information to them. What would your recommendation be how would that information come across to them? Would it be a portal? Would it be a concierge service? If you have any thoughts on that.
I think the world has gone, because we all get so crowded with internet stuff and social media, and I think it's going to be important to be able to offer up some sort of concierge service. Like, large businesses that are successful have kind of got it all figured out in the background, and the person you meet with is really just there to help guide you through it. That advisor isn't even really making the decisions. They're just making it easy for you to walk through the steps, right? Like, you go to see your bank manager. Not really thinking about, should I give you this loan? Like, that's technology in the background, but it's super complicated, and they just make it easier for you to walk through the steps and get that done. I think the obligation is to provide some sort of concierge service that just makes it easy to walk through and get to the answer you need.
Amazing, thank you. So I wanted to, we are at time. Do we have like time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience? 1 question? Does anyone, yes?
Director of Corporate Specialty Services. Thank you very much. Mr. Ragamashi, you showed a slide on Chinese debt, the fact that the Chinese government has lots of room. You didn't mention anything about Chinese businesses' debt. And I'm just wondering, from my recollection from reading The Economist, that there are some challenges with regards to that. Can you please speak to that?
Because I have to make a presentation in 20 minutes. That's why there are thousands of charts I would loved to show you. In China, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of private debt, and some of that is going sour as we speak. And I mean, that's been a concern for a while. But magically, things seem to be being taken care of by the government, because it's a centrally planned economy. They are basically, taking care of things, right? So you see the government with its heavy hand intervening in markets, trying to stabilize some of those companies that they can save. Others just go bankrupt. So in any other economy, I would have been very worried about the amount of debt. Like I said, emerging markets outside of China, for example, yeah, it's a real concern there, the amount of debt. But in China, centrally planned economy, maybe things are not as bad as what you read in the media.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I believe that puts us at time. So I wanted to thank both of you very much. Thank you, Krishen.
Thank you.
And thank you, Glenn.
Thank you.
After you.